As Ferenc said, my name is Fisher Derderian. I am the executive director of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, which was just recently founded, back in July this year, so it's just a few months old. And I was actually a former student of Sir Roger's at the University of Buckingham, was a part of his MA program, and had the pleasure of actually studying alongside one of our speakers for this session today, but was just, like everyone here, I think, was taken by the immense knowledge and really the wide expanse that Roger wrote on, that he thought on, that he was able to discuss, and that he produced. And I'd been a fan of his for years, and so was pleased to have the opportunity to study under him. As I'm sure anyone who's spent any personal time with Roger, it's just always an amazing, or rather, it was always an amazing experience just to listen to him and soak up all that he had to say. And over the course of my time as his student, we got to talking about what an organization might look like that was devoted to furthering his work, furthering his legacy. And this really birthed the idea of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. And it was in the works, up until he was diagnosed with cancer and passed away all too soon. And so on the occasion of his passing, had all the more reason to move forward with this project and to establish it. And to that extent, the mission of the foundation is to establish Scruton's legacy through the conservation, care, and continuation of traditional culture and wisdom. And we've held a number of conversations to that extent, and hope to hold a many number more. But we're not here for that today, so I'll stop there and move on to the actual conversation that we'll be having, which is with two different speakers. So I'll go ahead and introduce them in the order that they'll be presenting. The first speaker is Zoltán Peto, and you'll have to forgive me, Zoltán, as I say these things. With my American Californian tongue, I will probably butcher a number of the names, but you can correct me when you start speaking. Zoltán recently defended his PhD thesis at the Pázmány Péter Catholic University, and currently works as an assistant research fellow at the University of Public Services Tamás Molnár Research Institute in Budapest, Hungary. His interests are conservative political philosophy from the end of the 18th to the 21st century. He wrote a study about Edmund Burke and is currently working on publishing his dissertation about Erich Maria Ritter von Kuhnheldt-Leden. Our second speaker, very good, okay, I'm glad I passed with that. Our second speaker is Sebastian, who I mentioned I actually had the pleasure of studying alongside, and greatly benefited from his presence in the classroom, or I should say around the table eating and drinking wine. Sebastian is a PhD student at the University of Buckingham. He was supervised for MA research by Roger Scruton. He supervised his PhD research in political philosophy and Christian ethics until Scruton's death in January 2020. Sebastian has continued his doctoral research on the same subject, under the supervision of Dr. Andrew Pinsent and Dr. Alicia Guskinska. He is a regular wine columnist, and his book on the connection between metaphysics and aesthetics, The World as God's Icon, is to be published by Angelical Press this month. So with that, I'll step aside and let you take the floor, Zoltán.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I would like to greet everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here. My title of my... Can you hear me well? Everyone?
Yes, we can hear you well, Zoltán.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so the title of my paper sounds as Authority, Allegiance, Tradition, the Meaning of Conservatism by Roger Scruton. When, as a university student of history and aesthetics, I started to study Burke's reflections on the French Revolution, which was the topic of my thesis, Sir Roger Scruton's name, who was probably the most important voice of modern British conservatism in the 20th century, immediately came into the picture. Burke is considered to be the beginning of conservatism, and Scruton's self-identification as a conservative also began with an event in France during the 1968 students' uprising. As he says later, I quote him, "I suddenly realized I was on the other side. That's when I became a conservative. I knew I wanted to conserve things rather than pull them down. When I read these words, I felt an immediate sympathy with Scruton and also a need to delve deeper into the meaning of conservatism. There is no doubt that conservatism has a broader meaning than simple preservation. The most significant of the so-called and self-identified conservative thinkers of the 20th century, as Russell Kirk or Michael Oakeshott, reluctantly identified themselves with the idea of conservatism. For them, the word ism implied an ipso facto meaning of abstract doctrine, which they intended to avoid. However, we can interpret the possible differences of the meaning of the word conservatism more broadly. For example, if conservatism is not primarily defined as a worldview, but as an attitude arising from a worldview, interpreted in this way, it no longer refers primarily to values and certain dogmatics of the political ideas, but to an attitude that is related to the inevitable change. While political ideologies such as liberalism and socialism see the history of mankind as a slow process of moral, intellectual, and social self-perfection, as a kind of Darwinian evolution applied to the social political sphere, the survival of the fittest, ergo, the best structures, conservatism does not see inevitable change necessarily as progress. Burke saw the French Revolution, the beginning of the modern politics, not as progress, but as disaster. However, conservatism discovers not only degradation in the historical processes. We can also talk about a conservatism that thinks in terms of evolution. This evolution, however, is not related to the biological meaning of the term, as most conservatives tend to see man not as purely biological being, but a being which is both biological and spiritual. The conservative evaluation of the meaning of evolution in no way contains the idea of development open to infinity, as it would be an idea which is not supported by any empirical experience and also excludes transcendence. Conservative evolutionism can be linked to the development of civilizations and can be described as a slow accumulation of common experience. This position was emphasized primarily by classics as Burke and Hume as a response to the radicals' interpretation of the idea of human development as infinite progress. This development, conservatives say, is actually due to the interplay of favorable conditions, such as when the germ of a plant falls just where all the conditions can be found to grow into a huge tree. There is no inevitability in it, and the major threat to this is even the revolutionary impatience, which is perplexed by things being not purely rational or cannot be derived and deduced from strictly utilitarian principles. In his writings against the revolution, Burke spoke of the continuity of things, although the facts that make up our world do change, their essence remains the same. Roger Scruton's third book, Meaning of Conservatism, first published in 1980, and since then as a particularly influential work of modern conservative thinking, has been published several times and translated into many languages, Hungarian also. The work intended to outline the concepts, I quote him, with which conservatives might provide themselves with a creed. Quote him. In order to avoid misunderstandings, the author states at the very beginning of the work that the teaching of conservatism must be distinguished from both the underlying philosophy and the specific politics derived from it. Although there is no universal conservative policy, there is a misconception that there is no conservative thinking. It is a misunderstanding to believe there are no strong convictions and principles that encourage conservatives to act, nor a general view of society. At the same time, conservatives themselves must recognize that without theoretically exposed principles, their worldview can lose its intellectual appeal. And even if many of them do not want to believe it, I quote Scruton, by intellectuals that modern politics is made. For Scruton, a suitable starting point for articulating the principles is derived from the fact that conservatives' political approach of civil society differs from that of both liberals and socialists. Liberalism, which tends to see the state as an instrument of individual freedom, seeks to separate society from the state as much as possible, for that the state can restrict the individuum as little as possible. The conservative, according to Scruton, on the other hand, sees the state as an end in itself. Therefore, according to the conservative, the state is not a machine, but an organism, in fact, a person. The idea of the state requires the idea of a corporate person. The conservative state must protect the conservative society in which it is not the departments but the corporate persons, from companies to churches to clubs and schools, plays the main role. By strengthening autonomous institutions, the state strengthens itself. That's why the conservative conception of society is inseparable from the conception of the state. This approach, according to Scruton, has three key concepts: authority, allegiance, and tradition. What does authority mean? Above all, it is a recognized legitimate power, which we can best imagine on the basis of the analogy of the family, that is, the social unit which, like civil society, is not based on contract or choice, but on natural need. From the beginning, the child conforms to the power of the parents. It is the inalienable duty of parents to direct their children. In this relation is the power, namely the power based on authority, which the parent already possesses when the child is born. Authority, however, is not identical with power. It signifies the acceptance of the right to exercise power. Its recognition thus presupposes the legitimacy of power. Power without authority is pathetic. It breeds violence without arousing respect. Power and authority seek each other. Their pursuit is the core of politics, and the state created by their encounter is the existing institutional order. The conservative assumes that the state needs power for authority. Another issue is that he does not want to see this power naked in the sphere of politics, but clothed in the constitution, operated through the legal system. According to Scruton, our obligations to the state, like those to the family, do not arise from a free commitment. The possibility of a treaty in itself presupposes an existing social order, not only because without it would hardly be possible to keep a treaty, although this is also true, but and even more so, because the concept of the treaty presupposes common institutions and the common concept of freedom. They cannot come from a contract that is made possible even by them. It can be said that society exists through authority, and the recognition of this authority also means allegiance to a bond that is not based on a treaty, but is actually transcendental. Allegiance is undoubtedly a condition of social existence. It makes society more than a set of individuals, as liberals tend to think. As Scruton argues, the condition of mankind requires that individuals, while they exist and act as autonomous beings, do so only because they can first identify themselves as something greater, as members of a society, group, class, state, or nation. Allegiance makes necessary the holding of traditions, and this thought leads to the third concept needed to describe a conservative conception of society. The essence of tradition can be grasped in the fact that it can be traced back to an intention not directed towards the future, but towards the past. According to Scruton, tradition is not simply a custom or a rite, but a very important form of social knowledge. Burke thought of this kind of knowledge, criticizing the a priori thinking of the French revolutionaries. Through tradition, the individual acquires the ability to tacitly understand social habits, thereby knowing what he or she does when he or she enters the network of social contact. Tradition can also be a factor which can be the antagonist of freedom, or at least the abstract and ideological view on freedom. In Scruton's views, however, freedom cannot be in the heart of conservative thought. I quote him, hence the aim at freedom is at the same time to aim at the constraint which is its precondition. According to him, freedom is not a precondition, but a consequence of accepted social relations. If we want to value freedom, we must also value what makes it possible. That is the social order as a cornerstone of personality and identity. The main difference between conservatism and liberalism lies in the fact that for the former, individual freedom is not of absolute value, but is subordinated to other higher values, primarily the authority of legitimate government. Scruton's conviction evokes Burke. In politics, it is not primarily freedom that satisfies people, but good government. And without institutions, freedom is worth nothing. The freedom enjoyed and respected by the English was not born as a realization of some kind of abstract idea of freedom, but the legacy of historically established institutions without which it would not have been viable. From emphasizing the limits of freedom stems a kind of suspicion of democracy. Today, politicians and the most of the political thinkers do not dare to openly question the principles of democracy. At most, they criticize some of its concrete forms and solutions. However, according to Scruton, conservatives need to be aware that governmental legitimacy cannot be gained purely by democratic elections. Burke therefore did not think in the reflections that universal suffrage has anything to do with governmental legitimacy, reminds Scruton his readers. Democratic elections are neither a necessary nor a sufficient principle of representation, because the principle of representation belongs to institutions that can only fulfill their purpose with a background of solid authority. The relentless democratization of institutions with authority can lead to a situation when power falling into the hands of those who can circumvent the responsibility of exercising it. Even democracy must be based on a continuum that does not stem from the principle of democracy itself, but from the continuity of institutions and authorities. Democracy needs a constitution, and that must be outside the control of democratic change. However, there is another reason why conservatives are often skeptical of democratic procedures. And this can be traced back to the realization that even if a democracy is happened to work fairly, it will always serve the needs of those in the present. It does not take into account the aspects of those who are no longer with us or are not yet with us. Burke has already articulated the importance of taking into account the deceased and the unborn. But according to Scruton, it is worth to emphasizing this again. From the beginning of time, respect for the dead was the foundation of institution building. The respect shown for them forbids us to treat their heritage arbitrarily. By respecting the dead, we also protect the interests of our descendants. Democracy must therefore be limited so that the voices of the dead and the unborn are to be heard in the political processes. Conservatives therefore see the traditional and also a constitutional monarchy as a very fortunate form of political order. Since the ruler is not elected by the votes of the citizens, he cannot be seen merely as representing the interests of the present generations. And I quote Scruton, and to argue that the hereditary principle confers office and responsibility at random and without consideration to the fitness of the person who receives them is to repeat an objection to every mode of preferment. It is to be supposed that the ability to fascinate an electorate, as Hitler did, has some connection with the fitness for public office. Thank you for your attention.
And now we can hear from Sebastian, if you're ready to take the floor.
Okay, thanks, Fisher. And that was very nice to listen to. Thanks, Zoltán. Well, it's a great honor to speak here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. I'll touch on some of the same themes, particularly the focus on the importance of the corporate person as a major theme to conservative thinking, and the role this plays in understanding the democratic process. But I'm coming to this from the angle of the question of patriotism and national identity. I was asked, or at least told, to feel free to drop in something personal. And certainly, in engaging with this topic, I'm engaging with a way in which Roger was able to straighten out some things for me. There's been a tension in my own life between ethnic identity and national identity, coming from Mediterranean stock on my paternal side and Polish stock on my maternal side, and now having married a Romanian and living in a bilingual household. All of this, you know, if I were a dog, I definitely would not be a pedigree. Let's put it that way. And yet, regarding my attitude toward England as a nation, my interior experience, I feel intensely English. And so working out, navigating my way through this is certainly whatever tension there is there was resolved by thinking about Roger's ways of engaging with this. So first, I think one has to acknowledge that there has been a tendency on the political right to root cultural and political arguments in ethnic identity. And this is not a tendency found, interestingly enough, among the early conservatives. And you don't find arguments of that kind in Burke or Maistre or Chateaubriand or any of these people. And I mean, this is a historical point, but I do wonder whether this is a transposing of an Enlightenment principle of nationhood and certain sympathies that the enlightened despots and so forth had in the 18th century into later conservative or right-wing discourse. In any case, I think that the question of ethnic identity or racial history and identity, I think that these principles provide a completely insufficient foundation for conservative ideas. And I'll try to explore a little bit of that in a minute. Certainly, I think from reading Roger, he certainly such arguments or arguments of that kind, they at least had a certain arbitrariness to them. Why skin pigment and not something else? And also, they didn't seem to really lead anywhere. And interestingly enough, I mean, it is worth commenting that I think largely under the influence of Roger, arguments, ethnic-based or racial-based arguments, race-based arguments, have been really totally removed from mainstream conservative discourse. And that territory is now largely occupied by the political left, who are increasingly adopting ethnicity-based arguments or arguments based on racial history. And I think it can be plausibly argued that the fruits of that have not been terribly good. The complexities of which I can't discuss here because of time constraints. Another point is that just from a pragmatic perspective, in an age of increasing movement of peoples and immigration and people going to different countries for work and so forth, these arguments are just frankly inappropriate, and rooting conservative arguments in principles of ethnic identity and racial history, it's counterproductive in that it alienates conservatism from mainstream political discourse. So that, I mean, that's more of a pragmatic point. In any case, considerations of ethnicity don't seem to deliver what accounts for patriotic feeling, but seem to be presented as symbolic for something that is threatened. So when the British National Party enthusiast or some kind of ultra right-wing figure is asked why do you love England, actually, even though he might have sympathy for all sorts of race-based arguments, those aren't the arguments he advances in order to account for his own affection toward England. He doesn't say, well, I love England because of the pasty complexion of the majority of people who live here. What he says is, our way of life and our national church and our parliament, and I think this is being threatened by, for example, a Muslim takeover of this town or this place. So this is what they're not actually racial concerns. So what I think the task is to recognize that these arguments are not appropriate and they don't lead anywhere. The line from Tennyson's poem Hansel Round, he says, that man's the best conservative who lops the moulded branch away. I think these are moulded branches that you have to lop away, but you have to nonetheless ask why they grew in the first place. And so if they are symbolic, actually, these anxieties around racial and ethnic identity, what are they symbolic of? And my own view here is that Roger's huge achievement was to reroute the question of patriotism and national identity in the appropriate moral disposition. And so I'll go into that in a little bit. But I'll start off by quoting from his early work, The Meaning of Conservatism. He says, quote, "Every society contains the seeds of a constitution in the form of custom, tradition, precedent, and law." So this is a theme that continues through all of Roger's thought, I think, that constitution is not to be understood in the revolutionary sense of a written manifesto, but is to be understood as a settled way of life in a territory settled by law. This is what the term denotes in his thought. I continue. But it may have to fight to preserve these, and from every successful fight, a degree of nationhood emerges. For most of us, the state means not just government, but also territory, language, administration, established institutions, all growing from the interaction of unconscious custom and reflective choice. He continues, the nation state is the state at the extreme of self-consciousness. It has its territory, its people, its language, sometimes even its church, end quote. So there are these themes that arise from very early on in his thinking about conservative attitude, prejudicial feeling, an affection for a settled territory, making a part of that territory one's own, the whole notion of homecoming and the role of property in his thought, a respect for the long-standing institutions of the constitution of that way of life, and a desire to understand them and to conserve them. And a desire to understand and in turn lay claim to a cultural inheritance, which you have an obligation to make your own. If you live in England, it's not enough simply to say, well, I suppose this is my culture because, you know, I watch Neighbours, I watch EastEnders in the afternoon or whatever. Well, what you have to do is really try to understand the cultural foundations of this land so that you can lay claim to them. And that's a moral disposition that is placed in the interiority of the subject. So these are the themes, this is the phenomena. The question is what actually accounts for this? And what emerges first in Roger's thought is what in How to Be a Conservative he refers to as the first person plural of settlement, the we of the nation. But, and Ferenc has already mentioned this facet already, but I think we have yet to discover just how important this is in the later thought of Roger. The second person perspective in Roger's thought, and the role this plays in his conservative approach not only to politics but to more broadly social criticism, seeing you as another I, and this he develops enormously in the uses of pessimism, in green philosophy, and particularly more than anywhere else in The Soul of the World. Seeing one's fellow countrymen as another subject, engaged in the same project, trying to understand your perspective and trying to have his perspective understood by you, to be afforded the same respect due to a reasonable person with very similar concerns. And for Roger, this was absolutely essential if you were going to have a functioning democracy, that when somebody voted differently to you, you had to assume that they had all the same concerns and desire for the nation's good, and a desire to see you and your family flourish and so on, and that's why they voted the way they did. Which is why if your preferred party suddenly found itself in, if the undesirable party found itself in power, he said that it was necessary to have an immediate desire to unite the country under that party because of this this ability to see all of those who voted that way as other eyes, other subjects, others seeking the same good as you. And in order to develop this second personal perspective, it was necessary to educate the soul. It was necessary to educate the soul, and this is why civil society before the state plays such a massive part in his thought, that it's necessary to have friendships and clubs and hobbies and churches where you participate in a liturgy together, because you're doing things not as simply a unified will of the us. It's no longer just the first person plural, we are doing this, but it's somewhere in between that and a number of isolated individuals. It's the union of subjects, it's the union of eyes, so to speak. And this is why, just to pick up on a point that was discussed earlier about, can art make us good? Well, maybe if we say art, maybe not, but perhaps if we broaden it out to can serious leisure make us good, of which art is a category? Can serious recreation, can that at which the humane disciplines point, can that make us good? Well, you might say another way to frame this question is, can being together and seeing the world from each other's perspectives, can that make you good? Well, I think there's a jolly robust case for saying yes. This could bring us back to Aristotle's point that the loner is either a god or a monster, and so and this was, I just want to pick up one last little point. This is completely consistent, I think, with a point that Roger made very briefly in 2018 in his discussion with Jordan Peterson at Cambridge, which is, he made this point that cultural appropriation, one of the great sins today, cultural appropriation is a fundamental prerequisite for patriotic feeling and national identity. That it is essential that the immigrant who arrives in England is willing to appropriate the culture of England, is willing to lay claim to that and make it his own. If he's going to settle and make a family and so forth, it's absolutely essential that that his children be raised in such a way as to believe that they are not isolated aliens in a foreign land, but that this is a place they can call home. It's also, and this is where you might want to, perhaps if he had lived longer, he would have done this. You could develop the second personal perspective to the corporate persons of nations. It's absolutely essential that each nation deems itself eligible to appropriate the cultures of other nations. The English really do believe that the curry is their national dish. This is right and this is good. And so when, Roger in an interview was once asked, could you sum up conservatism in one sentence? And he said, well, I can do better than that. I can sum it up in a word. Conservatism is love. Says, in as much as it is a philosophy, conservatism is the disposition to affirm things, to choose things, to hold on to things, to love things, rather than to always ask the question, what can we tear down? What can we deconstruct? It's first and foremost, what can we grateful for? What can we hold on to? What can we treasure? And so I'll finish that with the whole stanza of Hands All Round by Alfred Lord Tennyson, because I think this pretty much sums up everything I have to say about this facet of Roger's thought. First, drink a health this solemn night, a health to England, every guest. That man's the best cosmopolite, who loves his native country best. May freedom's oak forever live, with stronger life from day to day. That man's the best conservative, who lops the mouldered branch away. Thank you.
Wonderful. Nice to clap for you. And I invite everyone watching to go ahead and submit questions if they have any. I don't see any coming in yet, so I'll go ahead and start with just a few questions for the both of you. Sebastian, you know, I'm in agreement, of course, with your point and being a fellow, you know, dedicated Scrutonian. Appreciate the arguments you're making. One can imagine an objection to, I think, perhaps your argument, or even Scruton's argument here, right? Where in the beginning you're talking about removing the idea of the nation, or trying to step back from the sort of ethnic basis of the nation, being perhaps based upon a skin tone or a pigment or something of this sort. And while we have our own issues here in America, you know, with race and everything else, and there's a number of questions, we at least, I think, in America are more open to the idea that, you know, America, even though it has, in a very Burkean sense, you know, history and traditions in which it's herited from others, wasn't so much based in a national identity insofar as an ethnic group, but has, you know, an amalgamation. Whereas perhaps in European states and really everywhere else in the world outside of the U.S., these things I think are closely tied to, you know, an ethnic people. And naturally we moved away from that, you know, over the last few centuries, and there are, you know, certain developments there that are to be considered too. But one can imagine, getting to my question, one can imagine someone raising the objection saying, well, all well and good, you know, right? Great with your Burkean points, and great that we have these traditions that are changing and flexible and hold on to certain truths, but also can incorporate new ones or new discoveries or new forms of life and living. But at the end of the day, you know, your English culture is still the English culture and the English ethnic one, and it's based upon years and centuries of white-paced Englishmen going about their business and trying to figure it out. And where's my place in that? You know, this of course is the common mantra we get from the university is, you know, we have all these white patriarchal figures. Where's the diversity? Where's the other skin tones included in that? And how can we actually separate your tradition from the fact that, you know, it is based upon an ethnic identity?
Yes. So the fundamental question is the ethnic dimension to nationhood, is it essential to nationhood, or is it a historical accident, right? Mm-hmm. I think the English should be outraged if the Italians start going around calling Christina Rossetti their national poet, for example, right? On the grounds that you know, on the grounds that her surname was Italian, when she was a devout English Anglican who broke off her engagement because her fiance became a ghastly papist of a foreign of a foreign religion. You know, this when you raise cases like that, it becomes very difficult to show how consistently you can say, well, nation has absolutely tied up with the blood in one's veins. And my concern is that actually this is extremely regressive regarding how to intellectually understand things. You know, part of the great intellectual revolution of Plato and Aristotle, the Socratic revolution, why we call it a fundamental break with the pre-Socratics, is precisely because they broke out of the purely materialist categories with which the pre-Socratics could only understand things. And, you know, whenever they asked themselves the question, what is being? The best they could come up with is being is fire, or being is water, or being is, you know, the introduction by Socrates of immaterial categories, the whole of Western intellectual history is just downstream from that revolution of the introduction of immaterial categories. And so the fact that we can't even think of how we morally stand toward the land which we have made our own and which has made us its own, without degenerating into purely materialist categories again, seems to me to go back to undo 2,300 years of intellectual progress.
Right. That's a great point. Well, here, I'll pick up one more question for you, Sebastian, before I go to a question for Zoltán from Ferenc. Ferenc says, crucial point, second person discourse of nations. We could go further, or could we go further and argue for a dignity of nations?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, could you repeat?
Well, that was a question to Sebastian.
That's Sebastian.
Sorry.
Yeah, then we'll get to you.
Sorry. Okay.
Yes. Well, I don't. It depends what is meant by the term dignity here. But what I would say is that one of the values presupposed in most of what I've been saying is that your attitude toward first the settled territory and then the culture and the constitution, the people, the civil society that is inhabited, is that there is something lovable there. There is something to be treasured and held on to. And this is one of the terrible, terrible things that has happened in our modern contemporary world, is that there is a huge amount of national shame about. The English have a history of constantly poking fun at the French and the Irish and so on. Whereas actually, if you go to Ireland or you go to Romania, as I am compelled to do by my wife, they poke fun at themselves all day because and not in a English self-deprecating way, by poking fun at yourself in order to signal that you really think you're the best. They do it because they really do think they're the worst people on earth, and this is a terrible thing. This is a terrible thing, particularly since the Romanians inhabit one of the most beautiful parts of Europe, and have an extraordinary culture and by the way, incredible wine. If you haven't drunk Romanian wine, you're really, really missing out. So this is yes, I think you can speak about a dignity of nations. The problem is not the problem is not the dignity of nations. The problem is the shaming of nations at the moment.
That's great, and we could go on there, I'm sure, and talk about cultural repudiation. But to get Zoltán here in the mix, Ferenc asks Zoltán, how did Scruton talk about monarchy in the present context?
Okay, now in Scruton one work, its title is England and Elegy. He spoke of monarchy in a quite nostalgic way. I I think. So the English monarchy, the British monarchy, okay, it's the correct, not English, to say British monarchy, is a it was always a constitutional monarchy, that the king in a parliament, they say. And now the role of the king or queen is just a symbolic role, and clearly and just symbolic. No power connected with monarchy. And I think it's in Scruton's view, it's not a progress. So I think Scruton's think about monarchy quite like Burke. So he thinks that this mixed constitution was a good thing, and could be maybe could be a kind of return to this mixed constitution is that would be a good thing, but it's not to be happen. He thinks.
Mm-hmm. So he's pessimistic about it.
Yeah. So he accepts democracy, but with reservations.
Okay, very good. Well, I'll ask one more question, I think, and then we can open up perhaps into more general question time for the whole speaker group today, including those who presented earlier. But thinking about different movements within these discussions, and look, I think at nationhood, at the sort of arguments that Roger would make. One of the big rising influences, I think, here in the States is Yoram Hazony and his book, The Virtues of Nationalism. And I don't know how widely translated it is, so I apologize if some people here haven't seen it or have limited access or viewing to it because of its language. But it's a big push, and Yoram has been hosting, or Hazony has been hosting a number of these national conservatism conferences, national conservative conferences, whatever they've been called, excuse me, in the name of the sort of Burkean argument. And when you look at the argument itself, right, he gives a lot of similar justifications and reasons to support the idea of the nation, as Roger does, and the traditions of a place, its history, its culture, its laws, so on and so forth. So I think on the whole, it's fairly in line with what Roger would have argued. But naturally, I think Roger also steered it clear of the term nationalism. And this is, of course, Hazony's big push, is saying we need to frame this in terms of nationalism. Now, what we're saying is we're not globalists, we're nationalists, and we want to defend the idea of the nation state. And so my question is to the two of you, and perhaps others too, if anyone else wants to weigh in, do we gain anything or lose anything by moving towards this new framework, insofar as we should accept it or not, or whether or not we should even accept it? But is there anything to gain by going from patriotism to nationalism? I mean, arguing for your nation, whichever one it might be.
Well, I'll give that a go. I did write a small study on this. Regarding Roger's view of nationalism versus patriotism, and you're right. Roger had a very rum view of the term nationalism and its manifestations, and I think it's for the reasons that I gave, that nationalism is a reduction of national loyalty to materialist categories, to an ethnic category, whereas patriotism denotes a moral disposition. And he wanted to reroute the argument in patriotic feeling of national identity, of the gratitude you have to the land which has received you, whether by birth or invitation, and the gratitude that you have toward that land, and your desire to make a contribution to it. to its history. This is a moral attitude and completely consistent with conservatism as attitudinal rather than ideological, over the materialistic notion of this is my nation because of reasons of blood and soil. You know, that this is that is I'm sorry, Roger was pretty historically literate. He knew we've done all of that. Okay, the 20th century was the saddest century ever, because we've gone through all of that. So the whole argument had to be rerouted, and I think that was one of his great achievements.
Great. Any other thoughts from Zoltán or anyone else for that matter? Any of our other speakers?
Raymond, I think, has something to say.
Sorry, I can't work the chat box, so I apologise for being an analog part yet again. I thought it was a beautiful talk, Sebastian, but I guess your final comment, which is about conservatism is love, one would expect then moving to the right will be more love, but that's actually not what empirically one sees, particularly in the present history, how Europe is at the moment. So that's the first point, and I wonder whether you could address that. But the other is, if you look at the time that Burke was writing, one thing's not changed very much. The vast majority of people in the United Kingdom were living in absolutely grotesque poverty with scarcely any kind of support, justice, or anything. So if we've been Burkeans, remain Burkeans from 1791 or 1790, it'd be a pretty grim outlook for most people. So I know that's terribly simplifying, but I wonder whether you'd want to respond to those 2 points.
Both to me?
Yeah, they were both to your good self, yes, because they came out of your, I mean, although, yes, thank you.
Yes, okay, so another facet of Roger's thought, which I didn't talk about, but which, in fact, I think it deserves a whole conference, is fake love. Let's put it that way. Fake love, which he often used the phrase sentimentalism for this.
Yeah.
And I actually think that if you come across a good old-fashioned liberal, a good English or socialist like Orwell or something, right? What you find is you'll find differences between the worldview of that person and the conservative, but actually what you find is a genuine love for civil society. Okay, you find genuine love for civil society. That is what you ought to find among among conservatives. When you get to the caricature of conservatism in the kind of materialistic, nationalistic, right-wing movement that I've been criticizing, then what you don't find is you don't find a love for the nation. You find self-directed emotion, right? Yeah. Which is sentimentalism, which is, by the way, exactly the same fake emotion that you find on the person who goes out onto the street and sets fire to police cars with the belief that they are doing something good and noble. Well, the whole act is actually a celebration of self, and so I think you just find less love the more caricatured true emotion becomes into emotional fakery. Regarding Burke, I don't know if I have misunderstood the objection, but Burke was not. He never argued for maintaining Europe in an 18th century social state. In fact, there are at least two sentences in the Reflections in which he explicitly states, "I am advocating change." He says, right? Well, but what kind of well, it's not revolutionary change, it's organic change. It's not change imposed by self-elected elites or anything like that. It's change that comes through. And one of the things that good old-fashioned English socialists used to understand, is precisely that good organic change did come up through civil society. You won't find many who think that today, but that is what they used to think. So I don't think Burke was. I think that's a caricature of him.
Thank you. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Well, was someone else going to say something?
Yes, I would like to address the question actually that you raised, Fisher. Can you hear me in this way if I talk it with
Yeah,
the
coming through nicely.
Okay, I have a pro and a contra for your question. The pro comes from John Lukács, the Hungarian-born American historian of Jewish origin and Catholic religion. He argued in a late work of his that indeed nationalism is a dangerous path for conservatives and generally for nations, actually. Why? Because of the European historical experiences of the 20th century that was mentioned earlier. So actually, he said that, well, if we are conservatives and we want to rely our own experiences, we have to learn from it. An education of the soul or the self leads us to be careful about it. But that's basically about National Socialism, I would say, and of course the experience of catastrophe and the Holocaust that I mentioned in my talk as well. So that's the pro for Fisher's question or suggestion. And there is a contra, which is that Joram Hazony in his book, which I reviewed in Hungarian, argues, well, the first prerequisite for him is that, well, he is not talking about an ethnic nationality. So when he talks about the national conservative agenda, it's not an ethnic one. So in this regard, there is no real difference, I think, between nationality-based nationalism and the patriotic case, as neither of them would rely on the ethnic background. But what is the point? What is the strength, I think, of the argument? The argument is that if we take out, if you step out from the English-speaking conservative framework, where actually both in Britain and in the US we have got actually empires and not nations, then in a European conservative context or in the Western tradition, there is this other resource, the nation, as the basis of sovereignty, and he relies here on the biblical teaching of the Jewish nation and his own country's experience. But he could refer to other Western European countries or European countries as such. And the argument is this: there is no other political community which could actually establish a constitutional democracy but a nation state. So why should we get rid of them? That's the argument.
That's great. Well, thanks for weighing in on that, Ferenc. I'm just thinking how we want to continue here. Are we just moving to a more general discussion now? Should we go ahead with that? Yeah. Okay. Well, one question I did want to ask, and you know, this is always brought up. This is one of the things that people notice. Something that we touched upon, I think, generally in this last session with Zoltán and Sebastian, is this similarity between Edmund Burke and Roger Scruton, where here are two figures that were both started out really writing about aesthetics, thinking about beauty and art and these sorts of things. made their transition over to politics and more specifically a conservative one, and trying to, I think, conserve something that they saw important about their cultures. So I wondered if we might get some thoughts as to, what what the significance is of these similarities, and why we often see this sort of connection between the aesthetics and the conservative, the interest in aesthetics and the conservative disposition. And that's open to anyone that wants to jump in. I'm not directing that at anyone.
Okay, thank you. It's a very good question, but maybe it's not a rational connection with these two. So it's maybe it's a feeling that someone worth preserving is also beautiful, and the interest to be interested in beautiful is to be you say the love of things, and maybe it's a quite a platonic notion that beautiful is good also. And maybe that's why conservatism and the aesthetics is connected in some way, as Scruton and the Burke also.
Can I provoke Zoltán on that issue? I think that it was Sebastian who mentioned false or fake love. What if there is a fake beauty as well, or false beauty? The sort of beauty which cheats you and which looks nice and enchanting, and then when you open it up or when you look behind, it's ugly and immoral even. We know about this sort of phenomenon, both from personal experience and from art history. What is more, you can even argue that beauty as such is something like that. It cheats you. Mm-hmm. It presents a world that looks nice and utopian and perfect, and that's not the case. We all know, and he knows it, Scruton. He wrote that book on pessimism. So how comes beauty? Beauty cheats you, and it's a false, a fake thing. It's immoral. What's your answer to that?
Well, can I speak to that for a
Sure.
brief moment? I think there is a connection between the conservative attitude and a sensitivity, an aesthetic sensitivity, and the connection is second personal perspective. For example, in the mid 20th century, the Marxists were very, very interested in art, but their reflections on art are in terms of its use. What are its propagandistic purposes? Whereas conservative philosophers from Burke through Hegel and Roger have a desire to write about art as if it is valuable as an end rather than a means to something. Now, when you approach a painting, for example, you cannot simply think about your own view of it, or you're sharing in a community of criticism of the painting, and you're in some way emptying yourself of your vision of the world so as to adopt the vision of the world possessed by the artist, so that he could apprehend what he's embodied, incarnated in this canvas or whatever. So art becomes profoundly second personal when you cease to see it as a use or a means, and start to see it as an end. Which I would, just as a final point, say this is why the great and terrible ideologies of the 20th century did fall in, at the level of art, music, architecture, and all of these things, fall into exactly the kind of fake beauty or kitsch that you're raising as problematic.
That's great, Sebastian. And I wanted to bring Alicia in on this too. And I don't know if you're prepared to speak to this, Alicia, but going further with this idea of sentimentality and kitsch and really bad art and what that might look like, I wondered if you or someone else on this call really might make the distinction or help clarify the distinction that Roger makes in his work between imagination and fantasy. I think that might be a helpful one for us to consider in the midst of this.
Thank you. I'm happy to step in and to say something on that. But I think what is always important to me when we talk about Roger's conservatism, about how his philosophy or philosophy is translated into everyday life or into everyday politics, I'm always worried that we will end up making caricatures. We always have to make a distinction, or at least I think it's important to make a distinction. Are we dealing with philosophy or are we dealing with politics? Because it's true that for Roger, for the way he looked to art, for example, that he saw it as an end and not just as a tool or only as something superficial. And then you Sebastian referred to the Marxist, or did you say Marxist or the communists? They looked like that, and this doesn't give the whole picture. We cannot understand the world through a couple of philosophers and this complex question. I think Roger was very disappointed in many politicians today, in the Conservative Party today. I don't think they understood art or judgment or anything as in such a profound way as Roger did. So you can, of course, point to the left or to the middle or where do you want and say they did not understand, but actually who does understand on the political, in the political arena, the profound ideas of Roger. And to be honest, I think not many people do. So I think it's just important to distinguish conservative philosophy with conservative politics, and it's not only I think it's also to protect Roger, because a lot of conservative politicians, they claim to be huge admirers of Roger, but actually they philosophy because they're so superficial. The things they say are in conflict with Roger's philosophy. And I think Roger often was, actually, he was in a way said that people don't read him. And he was not said that the conservatives do not read him, but even people on the left stop reading him because we politicize everything. So if we think somebody wrong side of history, so for the left it was Roger, they didn't read him. Well, it's a mistake that they have done. You should read people who do the effort to think for themselves, and those it's still not the majority that thinks for himself or herself. And Roger was one person that did that. And so I did not really answer your question, maybe, Fisher, but I think that's a very important thing. If we want to protect Roger's legacy for the future, and if we want him, and if we wish him a huge audience, and if we want that his philosophy will be read not only by our contemporaries today, but also for the future to come, I really think it's important to always stress that he was a conservative philosopher. And gosh, I really hope the conservative parties will really read him. And if all the people who would call themselves conservatives would at least be like half as Roger was, then we would already live in a better world.
Yeah.
That's a great point, Alicia, and much appreciated. And of course, this, to give a personal plug here, is one of the great goals of the foundation, is really, asking the question, how do we insert, a Scrutonian strain of thought into public discourse today? And how do we bring Roger's thought to bear on these great questions of importance, insofar as architecture is concerned, or different other forms of culture, but also politics more generally. So I'm right there with you, and appreciate the correction. I'm going to push you back to the original question I asked you, though, Alicia, and say, might you say a word on imagination versus
something? Ferenc wants to add something.
No. I think I hear first Alicia, and I would return to the question of Sebastian about the second person issue. But first, Alicia.
No, I talked already enough, so.
Okay, then we can return to that as well. But I would like to join the problem that Sebastian addressed. He answered my question about the fakeness or falsity of beauty. And he said that the second person perspective is gained by an appreciation of beauty, and that way we can connect it to morality and the education of the soul. But my question is this: I think it's almost doing the job, but still to try to push it forward. What if we say that, well, the second person perspective should be there, even if the artist is not presenting a beautiful world, but an ugly one, or at least one in which beauty and ugliness are both there. So why should the artist be a classicist, a kind of perfectionist, a new Mozart? 20th century art claims that, well, the world is not as harmonical and perfect as Mozart's music would suggest. So in fact, to understand the other is to understand his or her angst, his or her problems in the world, and the artist can, address our attention and call us to sympathize with his or her feelings, if the case is not for beauty, but a case for this perplex city of the human condition, including the tragic and the decay of culture. So I think an honest artist, one can argue, should provoke our interest and therefore help us educate our souls by invoking it through calling our attention to the tragic, to the ugly, to the inhuman.
Well, can I speak to that for a moment? I'll try to be brief, but I think the Western tradition of art is exactly the place where you find a response to this. If you want to go down the route of the transcendental attributes and how beauty is convertible with goodness and truth and this sort of thing, then it becomes very difficult to respond to your question. But if you want to go down the route of the subject's response to an artistic achievement, which is where I brought in the issue of genuine emotion and fake emotion, whether what it invokes in you is second personal perspective or self-directed emotion, where actually you're suddenly gushing over your own response to the thing. This is the sign of a genuine artistic achievement, that it invokes in you the former. And this is exactly what crucifixion scenes do, for example. Crucifixion scenes are not images of the perfect and the beautiful and the serene and so forth. It is an image of a man being tortured to death. right? And crucifixion scenes invoke second personal perspective, and so does the whole artistic tradition centered on the Passion and the Crucifixion. This is why when Roger did his famous documentary with the BBC, he ended with a meditation on Pergolese's Starboard Martyr, and he comments, the whole of human suffering is encapsulated in this one piece of music. Well, that's an expression of second personal perspective. And that is why it is a huge artistic achievement.
Well, and just to add on a fun little point there, Sebastian, there of course is that great scene in the BBC documentary when he's talking to, the name escapes me of the artist, but a modern artist saying something about, well, the point of art is to make that which is not beautiful, beautiful, to take trash and put it on a pedestal for us to contemplate. And Roger's characteristic short retort is, yes, like a can of shit. And this just catches the man off guard because, well, when you put it in those terms, okay, this is a little bit silly.
Yeah.
I think Ray want to join.
Yeah. Sorry, can I?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. I mean, very interesting to talk about the second person perspective. Because in many ways, when it's art that appeals to us collectively, like architecture, which clearly one of Roger's major preoccupations, one wonders whether actually it can be gathered up into the I-thou relationship. And I remember having a conversation with Roger. We both had a lot to drink, so this is probably not reliable as a report. But he agreed that in a sense, as well as the second person perspective, the first person plural was very important, we. And then I said to him, well, the talk of we, I just read Slavenka Drakulić's wonderful essays. She just escaped from communism. She's a Croatian writer, a wonderful writer. And she said, at last I was free, no longer to say we, but to say I. And I think Roger's relationship to we, the collective we, the we of the community, was quite ambivalent. And I wonder if that's why he focused very much in his later years on Steve Darwell and other people, Buber and so on the second person perspective. But actually there's a lot of the we perspective implicit in his thinking. But I'm speaking now as a non-scholar, and I'd be interested in what the scholars think. Good. I mean,
I mean, I could have a go. I'm aware I've been chatting away a lot, so I was wondering if someone else.
Well, I could join here by way of saying that we are returning here. When we talk about the we are talking about the public.
Yeah.
So the dimension of the public or civil society, for that matter. Sebastian used the term, and. In the same time, we are talking about the political community as well, in the sense of the community as a person, as was mentioned by Zoltán as well. So it's very interesting. Or, talking. My talk was about the Aristotelian Platonic tradition. In that tradition, of course, there was no such thing as a state. So they could say, well, political affairs are public affairs, and in that sense that there was no danger of mixing up politics and culture, for example, issues of social affairs, but not political affairs. That was not a problem for them. For us, it is a problem, and I think that in that respect, Scruton is a member of the British tradition, where the state is always, a danger. And the Central European experience, which was mentioned by Ray, reaffirmed it, that the state is a very dangerous agent. So if the we of our talk refers to the state as a political agent, let's keep it as far away as possible. That's his understanding, I guess, here when he emphasizes. He gives an emphasis to the distance from the we perspective. On the other hand, he was, one of his favorites was Hegel. And what else does Hegel, if not, building up step by step, as Aristotle, by the way, did. And there is a literature on the connections between Hegel and the Aristotelian tradition. Building up from the individual's, inclusion in a family, society, and finally the state as the most perfect form of human community. So there is this ambivalence in the great tradition of modernity, which was not there, I would claim, for the Greeks, for the Greek community.
I have to dissent in all of Roger's books on conservatism. He rails against the view that the state is dangerous, or the state should be seen as an enemy or kept at arm's length or anything like that. He affirms the absolute need for a political order. What he believes is, in the Hegelian way you just described, that the political order arises out of the constitution, the settled way of life of civil society, of the pre-political moral unity, which is the nation, this people who live together. What he had no appreciation for is something that would be better termed an anti-state, which is this great monster believing itself to be the author of civil society, right? Which unfortunately has been the Eastern European conception of the state in the 20th century.
But it was a Russian, notion, not an Eastern European. Be careful.
Or a communist.
No,
yes.
No, I entirely. But this is so. I just think the term state is just being used in two different ways here.
But I think that's because of Roger, actually, because when he writes about the communist state, he has this very negative sense, and which was mentioned by Ray. And when he speaks about his own, tradition or his own ideal, then the state becomes that nice things which builds up. But as soon as he talks about the Conservative Party in present-day Britain as representing the state, he is much more careful once again. So again, I think the dilemma is within the oeuvre of Roger, and in that sense, I share Ray's point that this, this is a huge work and a huge and sometimes a very self-contradictory oeuvre. And in fact, our job is, in this sense, to try to work out what is relevant and what is the solution for the contradictions, or to point out the contradictions and learn from that. It's not like a saint that we are discussing and a hagiography that we would like to write, but try to work with it.
Maybe I just have a comment on this.
Sure.
So maybe I think Scruton thinks that there is a bureaucratization in modern times of the state, and that's why. So the England analogy in this work, he refers this bureaucratization of the old or not the recent evaluation of the state. And maybe that's why, because that's bureaucratization causes this ambivalence, maybe.
Yes, the Weberian concept.
Yes.
Well, I wanted to jump in here and just see if we had any more questions from our audience.
Hello?
I know we're going around.
I think Albert wants to ask. Albert Schotter wants to ask.
Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, if it's okay, I have a question for Ray, and it moves on nicely from the idea of because I don't know Roger's, I don't know the work England Analogy. I'm looking forward to reading it, but yeah, Weber talked about the disenchantment of society, and I know that yourself, Ray, and Roger talked about scientism and the kind of overreach of post-Enlightenment rationalization. And it's quite a general question, really. I just wonder, I wonder whether it's worth thinking about whether different personalities on an individual level, whether some people might benefit from a more creative approach by way of kind of appreciating art and culture, and other people. This is kind of a personal discovery from studying philosophy. Myself, I'm very much somebody who exists in the world of feelings, and philosophy has really taught me how to separate out the reason. And so I think on a personal level, maybe some of us require a bit more feeling, and some of us require a bit more reason. And as a neuroscientist, I don't know whether you have any a neurosurgeon, sorry, I don't know whether you have any experience of if there's evidence for that being a worthwhile angle.
I'm not a neurosurgeon except by accident in a car. So basically, I am indeed into neuroscience. I think neuroscience has little or nothing to say about this. I mean, speaking as a neuroscientist, I know how little neuroscience takes. I remember there's a famous discussion between Chekhov and Tolstoy, and Tolstoy was going on and on about peasant virtues, and Chekhov says, look, I was brought up amongst the buggers. I know how awful they are. And I feel as if, likewise, other people are dazzled by neuroscience, and I know actually how little it tells us about ourselves, particularly in these rather complex questions. I mean, it's very interesting what you say, but it's difficult to imagine a legislation that, as it were, was so specific that it legislated for the balance in people to the extent to which they wish to be regulated or unregulated and so on. It's quite interesting. The whole disenchantment story has proved to be more complex. Clearly, there were two dimensions to the Weberian disenchantment. One is, as it were, the advance of science and no longer looking to magical explanations of what happens or to religious or spiritual explanations. And the other, of course, was the advance of bureaucracy. And again, I think Weber, there may be, I'm sure there are Weber experts certainly who know more than I do in amongst the rest of us, but it seems to me that Weber was very ambivalent about that. There was a kind of deep honesty and accountability in bureaucracy. At the same time, there was a stifling constraint. But coming back to your particular question, it would be difficult to know how to modulate the extent to which a state is bureaucratic, and indeed the scope of a state, to, as it were, to be tweaked for the different requirements, spiritual outlooks, and so on, for the populace. So it's an interesting question, but it's not one I think would be easy to answer. Certainly beyond my pay grade to answer. Yeah. I'm just hoping there's somebody out there who can give you your money's worth and answer the question. Sort of, you can ask for your money back.
I feel slightly uncomfortable with the notion of separating out reason from emotion. The two certainly must be distinguished, but one of the things that one of the great achievements I would say of Roger's writings was actually the integration of reason and emotion. You think there's a line I don't know where, in one of St. Paul's epistles, in which he says you must crucify the body with all of its emotions. And you might think this sounds rather grim, but he immediately begins talking about the resurrection. Of course, what St. Paul has in mind is that if you can integrate the life of the emotions and the passions, then you get them back again glorified. The Baroque cathedral is not a work of pure emotion, not a work of pure reason. The Baroque cathedral is the fruit of a grace-filled integration of reason and emotion. And so I would anyway. That's just a little thought on that.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Maybe I can clarify the question for either of you then, if you can still hear me. Yeah. I mean, the question is more to do with salvation in art, actually, which is my bad for not phrasing it quite succinctly enough. But for Ray specifically, the idea of salvation in art, I mean, salvation can be seen as quite a personal thing, and I mean, the disenchantment is a little bit misleading because it comes from Schiller. Yeah. But I don't really know how Weber links between Schiller and Scruton. But nevertheless, the idea of salvation in art for some people, I mean, Ray, do you think, for instance, that it's a viable position to take, to say that for some people salvation can come through an intellectual, a more reasoned practice, and for others it can come through a more emotional practice, and maybe that's it.
I mean, that seems prima facie quite plausible. Whether there's any salvation to be available ultimately for those of us who are secular, of a secular disposition, obviously there is nothing in any way will cancel death and all the losses on the way to death. So in that sense, salvation is not available. But clearly there are intermediate forms of salvation, of transformation of one's life, and of the sense of a life worth living and worth to have lived. Whether you could partition that between those who get joy through intellectual activity and then those who get joy through emotional engagement, I think that would be unlikely. I suspect, obviously, some people are extreme in one respect or the other, but generally most of us are a mixture. And I'm very much with Sebastian. Reason is and should be the slave of the emotions, and they are inseparable. There's a lovely line from Lichtenberg. He said, "I got angry on my own advice." And there's tremendous interaction between the reasons one has and the emotions one feels. Yeah.